Hello there and welcome back to the Closet Historian and back to my sewing room for another project. Now today I have something a little bit different and a little bit special to do with all of you because going way back to the halcyon days of 2019, I was still working in my last day job before I became a full-time YouTuber, working with heat transfer vinyl to make custom t-shirts for dance teams and cheerleading and all that kind of stuff. Working with a lot of shiny, sparkly stuff, but on fast fashion t-shirts, which was not something I felt morally good about and also just was kind of a drag. But while I was working with all those fun heat transfer vinyls, I just thought about the fashion applications. What could be done using those materials to create custom textiles and custom designs for more fashion forward clothing, or in my case, fashion backwards clothing often enough. And I was kind of burned out on working with heat transfer vinyl just because it's what I did for my day job for too many hours at a time, honestly. And so I kind of had this idea on the back burner. If I ever could invest in a machine, if I could ever, give it a try on my own, it was something I wanted to experiment with, but couldn't really fit into my schedule or budget until now. Because heat transfer vinyl doesn't come in just vinyl finishes. That means that I can use, matte or shiny color cutouts, but also metallics of any persuasion, including holographic and like soft sort of duochrome colors. That means I can use like a carbon fiber, spot gloss, spot mattifying, and also flock material, so faux velvet finishes, so I can create an almost faux cut velvet look to fabric, which is what we're going to be experimenting with today. But the dress pattern itself is just going to be consisting of my regular bodice block and my regular A-line skirt, putting those together with a fun little sleeve that I made over on Patreon recently to put together a rather simple dress with a fun textile. But despite the design being on the simpler side today, I did have a lot of work to do when it came to getting the designs from my head onto the dress itself, so we better go ahead and get started. Now, of course, you can find any clip art or design on the internet and probably figure out how to make it work, but I was actually finding it hard to design that way, so I decided to go ahead and directly draw on a tracing of my bodice block. So I have a tracing of my bodice block here. I'm using a light color marker to sketch in sort of what I think I might want, and then I'll refine everything in a darker color marker later. Of course, even better than this is to do everything initially in pencil and then only ink what you really like. It'll make scanning everything into the computer later much easier, which you'll see when I get to that step of the process here. For this first experiment with the flock vinyl material, I wanted to go ahead and try and create something rather arts and crafts movement inspired, which is around the same period almost as Art Nouveau. They kind of overlap, but arts and crafts is a little bit more rustic in the sense that it was all about the handicraft, all about making things not by machine, kind of rejecting the industrialization that had happened in the century prior. And of course there was a variety of design at this time, even within this movement. You have designers like William Morris, of course, which we all recognize, the wallpaper patterns, which are just stunning, and then designers like Gustav Stickley, Frank Lloyd Wright, and Charles René Mackintosh. And my sketch today is inspired by all of these artists in some ways because it's just all this little arts and crafts box that's floating around in my mind, trying to call upon things I've seen in the past, designs, porcelain, architecture, all kinds of stuff that I have floating in my brain, sort of in a nebulous cloud where I just pull different things. So I'm just coming up with this on the fly, but that's the kind of inspiration I was thinking of while trying to sketch this design out. And you can see at various times here I'm folding the dart closed to draw over the dart. So this can be a rather full design despite having the darts will have to be sewn out of it. So like when you're designing where to put a pattern on fabric that is already printed, you kind of do this backwards where you think about where the pattern is going to end up on the bodice when you cut it out. But in this, instead of cutting out the pattern pieces from a printed fabric, I'm creating the print directly on the pre-cut pattern piece in some ways. So I've cut this out of paper. I'm going to be cutting this exact shape out of fabric so I can design exactly what I want, where I want on this piece of paper, and then translate that into the cut flock vinyl and iron that on. So in some ways it's like designing a custom textile, but with even more freedom of placement because you don't have to think about designing a flat, large piece of yardage. You're designing exactly for the pattern pieces you have in mind. So you design the style of the garment first, and then I can draw in or decide on the exact print and embellishment, I guess, afterwards. After the pattern drafting, as it were, is all finished. And of course, I don't really have any pattern drafting today. Again, this is just my basic bodice block with its 2 darts. I didn't even bother to move them for this first project, mostly because I was just so excited to start working with this vinyl that I wanted to jump right in. But I'm just sketching in what I want roughly with, of course, these Crayola washable markers that I use for pattern drafting all the time over here. This blue one started running out of ink, so I had to switch to purple eventually here. I wasn't sure if this was a design I would end up going with, but in the end, after I scanned this in and worked with it in Photoshop a little bit more, I was really pleased with how it was looking over here on the computer, and I was able to kind of hover the design over the exact color fabric I was using and look at it in different colors and in different combinations, rearrange the bits of the design if I wanted to, things like that. And that really helped me decide on this design. And after I was finished with my sketch, I went ahead and scanned it in 2 pieces that I just realigned here in Photoshop. And you can see this is just a black and white scan of my sketch that I did on my large flatbed scanner that I have here in the sewing room. And you can play with this in different ways to get this to be a black and white image, trying to get this as more of a vector. Of course, people who know how to use Photoshop very well and know how to use Adobe Illustrator will be laughing at me because I'm doing this all having never learned how to use these programs. I'm all self-taught with Photoshop and I don't know how to use Illustrator at all, which is sad but true. How do I have a degree in design without having learned those programs? It's an excellent question. Let's all remember I graduated in 2013. It was a while ago. They hadn't integrated Adobe fully into every program and certainly not into mine. But I basically made this black and white, and then I'm just going to refine all of these little edges in here. So I'm going to clean up my sketch, get rid of the under sketch, as it were, that's still kind of hiding in here. That pink marker originally was in here. And I'll grab this little small section of this sketch to show you how I finished this up after I had the entire image cleaned up. Of course, I had to go through everything and clean up all the edges and refine them how I wanted. But once I had done that, I'm going to take the design, I'll take the full design. Here I'm just showing you with a snippet of it. I'm going to go ahead and blur that a little bit using Gaussian blur to get a nice smooth edge on this. And I'm going to come down here on the layers panel and choose curves and just throw a curve on here and narrow it down until I like how my edges are looking. And then I'll just rasterize that. And then I have a much cleaner image, much more vector-like than I had before. And again, to all the graphics people who actually understand how to do this stuff, I apologize because I am not one of you, sadly enough. I am then going to import this design from Photoshop into the Silhouette Studio software here. This is the software that directly talks to my Cameo 4 Silhouette machine, the craft cutter that I now have here in the studio. I just invested in this as a bit of a Black Friday splurge to myself, a little bit of an upgrade here in the studio so I can now cut vinyl, and I'm very excited about it. This is the machine that makes all of this possible. This craft cutter is very similar to a Cricut machine or a Cricut machine, however that's actually pronounced. The Silhouette is just the kind of machine that I've used before, and since I was more familiar with it, I decided to go with this brand of machine. And I have my little virtual cutting mat here that I'm going to fit my design onto. And what I'm doing here is resizing the design to make sure that this leaf here is 2 inches wide, because I knew measuring my sketch on the actual pattern paper, the physical pattern, that I needed this to be about 2 inches. That way this would fit perfectly scale-wise back onto my fabric when I cut it out. And Silhouette is pretty good here at automatically tracing everything I put in here. Of course, this design is too big to fit on one sheet, so I'm going to have to go ahead and rearrange that so that I can print this out on multiple sheets, because my cutting mat and my cutter itself only cuts at 12 inches wide, and this design to go across my entire front bodice is more than 12 inches wide. Of course, it is symmetrical, so I can cut things in bits and then realign them later when I'm ironing my material onto the fabric. The other thing I want to do here is I want to remove the leaves from this design. So I've released the compound design here, so I've released it into its individual elements, and I can just copy my leaves off of here, open up a new document and just paste the leaves, and they're all still in the exact same position, so they will realign with the design just as they were when they were floating over here on the swirls. But I can go ahead and use this to cut them out of a different color of material, because I'll be cutting the leaves out of red flock vinyl today, and I'll be cutting the swirls out of a dark burgundy flock today. So I wanted to be able to do the leaves in a different color, and as you can see, the proper alignment of this would waste a lot of material, and since I'm going to have to realign most of this over on the fabric anyway, I might as well just condense this, kind of put them into pairs and stick this up on the first half of the material. That way I only have to use 4 or 5 inches of my flock material as opposed to this full kind of 12-inch section. But of course that does mean I'll have to rearrange my leaves, because if I just did it as one, they would all fit together in one like this, which would be quite convenient but does waste a lot of flock material. And after I have finalized each piece of my design, again, I'm going to have to cut this out in several sheets and several sections because it is too big for the cutter and for the material itself. I'm going to be using this Sizer Strip Flock Pro HTV heat transfer vinyl today for my design. And I want to make sure I have these settings for my little blade, the little cutter on this machine, set for this material. Always look up whatever material you're using, the best recommended settings for your particular cutter and your particular blade that you're using. So that was what I was doing there, adjusting the settings to make sure I was going to get a nice cut out of this. And you can test the settings in the little corner to make sure that it will come out just as you're expecting. I'm going to be going through this process in more detail between sketching, bringing everything into Photoshop, bringing everything over here into Silhouette. I'm going to go through this in a longer video that's just dedicated to this process alone because it is quite involved and I'm doing a lot of little tiny things here that I'm sure I need to explain in more detail and in a slower fashion. So I'll be doing that as a separate video with you soon. So this is a piece of that sizer material that's on a sticky mat. That was the virtual mat we were looking at while I was arranging my design. Here's the physical sticky mat that gets fed into this design. It looks like a printer, only instead of having ink, it has a little tiny blade that swivels around and will cut out your design for you. And that's why you have to set the depth of the blade, the speed, everything. Depends on what kind of material you're trying to cut. But of course you can cut all kinds of stuff on here. Heat transfer vinyls is just one of the types of material you can use with a craft cutter like this. So after that's finished cutting its design out, I can peel away the excess material. This is called weeding. Often enough, you're weeding out the design you want versus the design you don't want. This material is stuck to a sticky plastic backing, which is what we're using kind of as a like sticker base. And I'll use this sticky plastic to help me position these leaves later on onto my fabric so it'll stick into place before I can iron it there securely. But meanwhile, I do still need to cut my dress out of the fabric itself, so I'm making some quick facing patterns here back over on the blue patterning table of doom. Not a lot of patterning to do today, but I do have to make a couple of facings to match up with this bodice front that I was sketching on earlier. I have my basic bodice block back as well, and then I cut out my basic A-line skirt pattern from this fabric as well. This is a dull purple cotton sateen from moodfabrics.com. Paying attention to fiber type is important with HTV if you want to use these heat transfer vinyls. Some only stick to cotton, some only stick to nylon or polyester, so make sure to double check the type of material and the type of textile are going to play together nicely when it comes to start trying to iron on your design. This fabric has been pre-washed as well, and actually once all this HTV is on here, it will still be washable. It always shocked me how well HTV stays on clothing through different washes. I used to have to wear my branded shirts for that job that I had, wear the same 4 or 5 shirts to work all the time, and the HTV outlasted the shirts, honestly. The cotton of the t-shirts started deteriorating before the HTV vinyl did, so you'd be shocked at how well this stuff stays on. So I pre-washed my fabric, and this garment will be totally washable in the end. But I can start positioning my first design. I'm actually starting on the back of my garment here, where I did a little bit of a simpler design, just taking the elements from Photoshop and playing around with them on the back of a bodice to see what I liked. Wanted to do something a little bit simpler because this was going to be rather time consuming to get all of my designs onto the fabrics. But I positioned my decal kind of where I want it, and now I am ironing it into place. I have my iron turned all the way up, and then I also have a piece of this like tan heat protective or heat resistant material that you use between the iron and the plastic and the iron and the fabric so you don't get anything too crispy, too burnt. And of course, again, if you're using something that can melt, do be careful because you don't want to melt a polyester fabric. If you were doing something like this on, say, a polyester organza, be extremely careful. You want that iron hot enough that the glue on the back of the flock material will melt, but not hot enough that you'll melt the organza itself. So do be careful with this kind of thing. Luckily, cotton sateen is pretty hardy, so I didn't have to worry about that too much here. And you can see after I peel the plastic off, once it's mostly stuck, I give it another good iron just to make sure that these pieces are really stuck on here. I was using my clapper to help with that. And then I also ironed it again from the back until I could feel it was really secure on there. Usually this is done with a heat press, but I do not have a heat press. I just have an iron, and that'll do for now. And now that we have that kind of proof of concept going on for the back, I can start measuring and placing the decals for the front. You can see I'm piecing these together. I was trying to salvage as much of my flock material as possible, but some of it I cut. You can see these leaves here are cut kind of in a large piece. I cut out the little baby ones from the bottom. I was doing my best to kind of find a compromise between not wanting to have to reinvent the wheel with this design and yet also not wanting to waste too much of this red material, especially because I only got a couple of sheets of this red flock, so I didn't have a ton to go around with. Didn't really want to mess up. But again, because I only have my iron instead of like a large heat press, and I have these smaller sections because I'm cutting out on a small-ish cutter. I think these cutters, you can get them that do like a 15-inch width instead, but like hundreds of dollars for a larger machine for 3 more inches of width. I'll just make it work. And I am sketching on my darts here in tailor's chalk on the outside of my fabric. I have a center line done in chalk. All that chalk will wash away, the tailor's chalk here, eventually once I'm done with my garment, and it was just helpful to have some guidelines for where to place these designs, especially because this is such a symmetrical design. I wanted to make sure everything was aligned perfectly on either side, you know, mirrored down the center front. And after I had all my designs placed and ironed on into place, I could finally pinch and pin my darts from the backside so that I can sew those into place now that my flock material is all ironed on to the garment. And just sewing those as usual over here on the Singer 99K from the large end of the dart off the tip, and then I will tie the threads shut just like I always do over here on the machine, still using my 12 stitches per inch and Gutermann all-purpose thread. And as usual with me, I have a quite fitted design today, so I have 2 darts on the back and I have 4 darts on the bodice front. And then luckily, because this is an A-line skirt, I have no darts for the skirt, so it's just bodice darts today. And I'll go ahead and press those towards the center, and I can press the side darts down after I have those sewn into place, and I have to start working on my skirt. And after I pre-washed this fabric, it really did not want to iron flat again, which is kind of weird for a sateen. Usually it irons pretty well, so I had to give this one quite a bit of steam, a little bit of spray to get it to behave. I'm sure what happened is I forgot that it was in the dryer and came back the next day and it was, rolled up in a ball and therefore stayed pretty wrinkly, which is unfortunate. But I'm doing the same sort of operation here on the skirt front, layering my design. Luckily this flock, even if it gets a little bit of iron shine, you can kind of give it a bit of steam afterwards from the back and it'll come right back to life, which is nice. Something I had to learn as I started getting worried after I got a couple of sections shiny. But it perks back up, which is good, with a little bit of steam, a little bit of water. Just layering my design together here. Again, the way I came up with the skirt design on this dress was to take the bodice design sketch that I had. Once I had it in Photoshop, had the separate elements going on, I could rearrange them as I saw fit, playing around on a little fake skirt in Photoshop to see what I liked, so I could come up with a design that I felt was appropriate to match with the bodice, or kind of mirror the bodice design that I had originally sketched. So this dress was half sketching with my hands on the pattern piece and half playing around in Photoshop afterwards. So to honor the arts and crafts movement, I started with the arts and crafts method and switched to the industrial one. So sorry about that, guys. I did go ahead and serge my raw edges on this cotton sateen because, again, this dress will be fully washable and it's not going to be lined, so I wanted to have a little bit of more stability on the raw edges so I can throw it in the wash later and not worry about it. I will go ahead and start constructing everything now that my darts are sewn, so I can pin my shoulder seams here, my side seams, and then the shoulder seams for the neckline facing as well, because I'm going to finish this neckline with a facing today since I won't be lining this garment. With the design transferred onto both my front and back skirts as well, I can sew the side seams for that. And again, the A-line skirt is extremely simple, no darts, just 2 back pieces and 1 front piece. I'll have that center back seam where I will put my zipper in later. As we all know, I love a center back zipper. I rarely ever use a side zipper. It's just who I am. I don't like wearing them as much, and I don't like sewing them as much, so I'm a center back zipper gal. But I can go ahead and sew everything I just prepped over here on the machine as well. 1/2 inch seam allowance as usual. It's pretty rare for me to use anything else, and I will definitely let you know if I do. And I will be using a rather different sleeve today that actually I covered over on Patreon last month, so if you want the sleeve design from this particular dress, that is where that will be found. I didn't want to focus on the pattern drafting for this particular video. I just wanted to introduce the idea of using the silhouette cutter to do something like this, to make a custom design in flock or vinyl or any other material on a cut and sewn garment, as opposed to using HTV on t-shirts and athletic wear and athleisure, which is what it is mostly used for. I have seen these materials used more and more in costuming, both for film, I'm sure for theater as well, and then also in the cosplay sphere. They have very stretchy and very metallic vinyls, so you can put them onto stretch fabrics and use them for costumes or things like superhero suits, swimsuits, things like that. So this is something that gets used perhaps more still in dance wear, and then of course, yeah, athleisure and t-shirts and, you know, family reunion t-shirts and, I don't know, bridesmaids party shirts. Any time you need a custom matching shirt with your friends. It's not really my jam, honestly. So I'm more into sort of individual designs as opposed to infinitely repeated designs. However, that being said, I will go ahead and post the design that I used for this garment today. I'll post the graphic, I guess, or the clip art, as it were, over on my Pinterest. So if you wanted to use this exact design in any of your work, feel free to. I guess it's, you know, copyright to me legally, but as long as you're not selling it, feel free to use it as you should like. I am just, of course, pressing open all my seams that I just sewed, and then I can attach my facing to my bodice along the neckline here, pinning right sides together. Stitch that over here on the machine. I will then clip any of the curves and points here and give this a little bit of understitching just so it stays nicely in place as well. I did give this a tiny bit of a V neckline, but it's still a pretty high neck here. More real estate for doing the design work. And this was a kind of Halloween time period, like fall release color of sateen over on Mood. And they did have, I think, an orange and a harvest yellow as well. I think they even did a burgundy, which I don't know why I didn't grab some of the burgundy. That's a mistake on my part. Anytime there's a nice, rich color of cotton sateen, not that this is a rich color, it's much more of like a dull plum or like a dusted aubergine. If I were like, you know, in the field of naming nail polishes, it's sort of, you know, where you're coming up with weird paint names. If I were to name this color, I think I would say dusted aubergine, maybe. And of course, I think this design in silver on here would have been excellent. In gray, in black, naturally, in black flock. I do have some black flock here in the studio to use because you better believe I'm doing that. But I tried to be good for this first design and use actual color, you know, instead of just doing black immediately. Do I want to use different textures of black onto different textures of black fabric? So use a matte fabric and a shiny vinyl, things like that, and create like detailed textures of black fabric? You better believe it. But we'll get to those kinds of experiments later. With my bodice neckline finished and everything sewn together, I can go ahead and sew my bodice to my skirt along the waistline, so that's what I'm doing here. Pinning my bodice and skirt together along the waist, right sides together, of course. And I can go ahead and stitch that. Again, the construction for the dress itself, not too difficult today. Didn't take nearly as much time as it did to print, weed, and arrange, iron on all of the flock design elements. I can go ahead and then press that waist seam open. It's only subtly curved, so I didn't bother clipping it because this fabric does have a little bit of stretch in it as well. It doesn't behave too poorly, and it'll allow this to retain a little bit more stability in here, in this unlined garment. I then am going to go ahead and stitch from where the zipper will end down to the hem closed with a 1-inch seam allowance, since that's what I leave myself along the center back of my garments. And then I will fold back the top edges where the zipper will be set in, that same inch all along the seam allowance of the center back, just using my seam gauge to help me out with that, and pressing this into place. Of course, I'm using glass-headed fine pins here so I can iron right over them without any fear of melting anything. Press those edges back, and then I can set my zipper in the same way I always do. I can also put a card up to my lapped zipper video where I go into more detail about how I set zippers in here in my studio. And these were my funky little sleeves. I just had to put those together as well. They were my last step for this. I finished the dress entirely except for the sleeves because I was going to try something new and different with these, kind of an architectural pleated puff sleeve. So again, if you'd like to see how this sleeve was done, that video is over on Patreon for now, but I'm sure I'm going to experiment with this style further and they will end up on the channel eventually. And I did hem those sleeves with a shaped facing just because the sleeve hem on that is actually rather curved. It required a facing to finish it. I actually tried first to finish them with bias tape and it didn't work, so I had to take the bias tape back off, make the facing pattern, and finish them with facing. So technically I hemmed those sleeves twice. Isn't that nice? But I did go ahead and use this contrast red bias tape to finish the hem of the skirt of this dress as well, just so that when it peeks out as I move around, the hem will match the leaves of the design on the other side. And here is my finished dull purple cotton sateen dress with its custom flocked design, in burgundy and red, of course, which means I can pair this with either burgundy or red or both, or purple in the future. Not that I've ever found dull purple heels, but wouldn't I be glad if I did. I am super pleased with how this individual dress came out, but even more, I'm just excited about the possibilities of these materials, of the flock material, let alone the metallics and other colors of vinyl that I'm really excited to get started using and experimenting with on new designs. Thank you so much to my patrons for making investing in this machine and these materials possible. I'm really excited to push what I can do with these and really experiment at long last after dreaming about it for so long. I hope you enjoyed seeing how this project came together today, and thank you as always for watching. I'll be back with more sewing, vintage fashion, costuming, and crafting real soon, so I'll see you then. Bye!